A very warm welcome to the event of tonight, Social Media Council's Power to the People. My name is Alexandra Gese. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Greens EFA Group. I'm from Germany, and I'm the co-coordinator of the Greens Digital Working Group, and I was shadow rapporteur for the IMCO Committee's report of the Parliament on the Digital Services Act. We are organizing a series of 3 events. We started on Tuesday. I had an event yesterday, and now tonight we are speaking about social media councils. All these events are focusing on the Digital Services Act that, as everybody probably listening in knows, is going to be presented by the European Commission December 9th. It was supposed to come in on December 2nd, but due to COVID-19 making things very difficult for everybody, including the European Commission, it was postponed by a week. And the Digital Services Act is going to reform the 20-year-old e-commerce directive, and it will be accompanied by the Digital Markets Act that's going to set out new ex-ante rules for systemic operators, therefore addressing more the competition issues. And that gives us in Europe the opportunity to completely rethink what we want our digital interconnected world to look like, and to start fixing some of the issues with broken business model, hopefully opening up for a bright digital future in our world. So we have this event series to deepen the discussion around 3 key elements that I personally deem indispensable for the upcoming legislation, beyond issues of liability and competition that are also very important. So we started on Tuesday with algorithmic transparency and transparency of the decision-making models in general for content moderation. Then the second day, we spoke about a ban or strict boundaries for targeted advertising and the connection between targeted advertising and disinformation. And today, we're going to speak about independent social media councils, which are a rather new idea in the European conversation. I'm very happy not to be here alone, but to be in great company of 3 people I really value very much. And first of all, guest of honor tonight from the US, we have Roger McNamee. Hi, Roger, great to have you here. Over the course of a 34-year career, Roger pioneered several categories of tech investing, co-founding Integral Capital Partners, Silver Lake Partners, and Elevation Partners. And Roger's the author of a New York Times bestseller, Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. If you haven't read it, you absolutely have to read it. Really worth it. Which documents his journey from mentor to Mark Zuckerberg to critic of Facebook. Since April 2017, Roger has been engaged in a campaign to address the dark side of social media. A few months ago, he set up the Real Facebook Oversight Board, together with Shoshana Zuboff, Carol Cadwalader, and other very important names. Very honored to have you, Roger. And I think this is also important as a symbol, because a few days ago, a Google strategy paper on their lobbying strategy in Brussels was leaked. And one of the points they want to focus on is to picture every effort of regulating the American tech companies as something that is anti-American, that is going to hurt transatlantic relations. And personally, for me, it is very important to foster good relations with critics of the tech companies, and from the other side of the Atlantic, from your side of the Atlantic, since you are the first, you created them basically, you know them best. And I think you have very good advice to give us here in Europe, where we have the chance to regulate them. So it's really great that you're here today.
My pleasure.
I would like to introduce everybody, and then I'll give you the floor. But if you just want to say something quick, it's fine.
No.
Great. Then we have Eileen Culloty. Is that how you pronounce your name? I'm sorry, I should have asked before. I usually do that. Is that correct? Perfect. Thank you. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Dublin City University Institute for Future Media and Journalism, where she leads research on countering disinformation as part of the H2020 project Provenance. Specifically, she's investigating how to use information supports to challenge false beliefs and dissuade people from sharing disinformation. At the Dublin University, she's also working with colleagues who are heavily involved in the development of the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland. And we are very curious to hear from you how the city assemblies worked and how we could adapt them to be social media councils. Then we have Pierre-François Docquir. Pierre-François is a researcher and expert in the field of human rights law and internet and media law and regulation. He's the head of the Media Freedom Program at Article 19 after joining the organization in 2015 as the senior legal officer. Article 19 is an international human rights organization with a specific mandate and focus on the defense and promotion of freedom of expression. At Article 19, he's currently leading an initiative setting up a social media council in Ireland for the moderation of content on online platforms. This project offers an alternative to social media platforms governing decisions related to content moderation in a public forum. So you actually have a pilot project already working on what we are trying to set up in Europe, and that's going to be very interesting. And I'm deeply indebted to you because I came up with this idea because I read it, I got it from David Kay, and David Kay says it comes from you, it comes from Article 19, and that's why we got in touch already last year in the course of this year. So thank you very much for that great idea, and I hope we can implement it in Europe, and we'll hear a lot more from you. I would just do a little bit of housekeeping. I will do a few introductory remarks. Then we have lightning talks by each speaker for 10 minutes, followed by a moderated panel discussion. So you can come into the discussion. You can raise your hand if you want to ask a question personally or give a contribution. So please use the usual tool. You have to click on participants, and there you find the menu that says you can raise your hand there. You can also submit questions in writing. Please don't use the chat, but the Q&A tool. You find it on the bottom of your screen or on the top according to the kind of device you're using. So put your question in the Q&A tool and we will or answer it orally or in writing. This webinar will be recorded. So if for privacy issues you don't want your voice be heard or your name spoken by me, just use the Q&A tool and don't raise your hand because otherwise you'll be in the recording. Fantastic. So I would like to start with just a few words why we're speaking about this topic tonight. The social media councils are an idea that is not yet part of the European conversation around platform regulation, unless the other ideas we have discussed the past 2 nights, transparency and a ban on targeted advertising, which the Commission has picked up on and is working on. The Parliament has written about that extensively in its own initiative reports. But social media council is something I proposed in the parliamentary process, but it was not picked up by the other parties. But I think that wasn't because they were specifically against it. It's just that the idea hasn't been around long enough. It's not been discussed long enough. And therefore, it's very interesting to have these concrete examples tonight in order to show that this is something that can actually work, that in some part is just working. That's definitely not the solution of the problem, but I think it's part of the process. It is very clear that beyond oversight and beyond social media councils, we need very significant regulatory changes of the business models. And this will come with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And as Greens, we are in favor of strong regulation and especially of strong European enforcement, because we also want to avoid a situation like GDPR, where we have absolutely fantastic legislation, but because of the enforcement model, we have difficulties enforcing it. However, I think there are a series of good reasons to think that this kind of regulation will be necessary, but definitely not sufficient. First of all, tech by its very nature evolves very quickly, and the legislation takes more time because we need to gather evidence, we need to reflect on it, get an opinion, get a consensus, and therefore what might look great now might be obsolete even by the time we manage to pass it in the European Parliament, especially European legislation. Usually big legislation takes a term, it takes 3 or 4 years to be passed. And then there are huge gray areas, uncertainties, trade-offs, for example, between different forms of free speech, the free speech of who wants to speak up, but also the free speech of vulnerable groups that are targeted by hate speech and that are afraid of expressing their opinion freely in social media. There are studies showing that in Europe, 50% of women don't express their opinion freely in the internet because they're afraid of hate speech. And that's a form of free speech as well. And we have huge difficult trade-offs there. Then it's still hard to say who should decide. Should it be on content moderation? Should it be corporations? Should it be governments? I mean, my party usually would go for, in strong democracy, for strong government. But we have seen in the US, for example, that the US president was one of the major sources of disinformation, especially in the electoral process, but during his mandate, basically. And in Hungary, in Europe now, we have two countries, Hungary and Poland, that are blocking the whole 7-year budget, the enormous recovery package we have set up in Europe to get our economies over COVID, because they don't want to accept any kind of scrutiny on the rule of law in their countries. So we are not, I mean, we have our issues as well in Europe. And I think besides companies and governance, we need a vast and diversified ecosystems of actors from civil society that go from investigative journalists, fact checkers, NGOs, citizens council, different kind of forms of oversight. And we need to foster that kind of diversity, variety, kind of a landscape. And last but not least, and tech is changing, I think, the conditions of democracy itself. On the one hand, spreading disinformation and misinformation a lot quicker than good information. On the other hand, but connecting people in a way that has never been able before. And also increasing engagement with downsides, but also increasing the expectation of citizens to really participate in their political system and shaping their world. And that is a very good expectation, actually. So the question is, how can we turn that into real participation? And therefore, I think the model that Eileen is going to present from Ireland, that is really gaining track in Europe, where you involve normal citizens without a legal or technical background in decision-making is really very, very interesting, and something that might allow us to really reform and improve our democracies. So tonight we're focusing on this issue. We have seen Facebook, for example, building up an own oversight board, being very proud, presenting it very proudly to me, for example, as a legislator. But in a democratic society, what you really don't want to do, I think, is to privatize neither enforcement nor ethical decisions within a company. But because which board would seriously take decisions that might displease the CEO or cut the profits of that company to half? I mean, this is a ridiculous idea, but I think this is what the tech companies are really trying to do, to privatize the whole world. And this is something in Europe, I think we are lucky to still have a very different tradition, and to see a coexistence between strong public structures and strong companies. And there's a different balance. And I think we have to foster this third element of civic participation. Talking about social media council, there are different models that are possible. With Pierre, I think with your colleagues, we already discussed social media councils where the corporations have a seat at the table. Then we have more the councils with, or like the oversight, the Facebook oversight board, which has tech and legal experts. And Eileen is going to present really the citizens assemble model, where citizens without a technical background are represented. These are 3 different models. And it would be interesting to discuss how they could coexist in the European space in that kind of landscape. So I think that was enough from my side. Roger, you have the floor for your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. It is a great honor for me to be part of this program today. And I want to start with a very simple word of thanks. Europe has led the way in both raising the alarm and exploring various regulatory frameworks that could be applied to internet platforms. And candidly, what we have learned from the European experiments is indispensable. And I come bearing a little bit of good news. The United States has just completed what is, I think, objectively the most ridiculous presidential election campaign in the country's history. And it is one where disinformation completely dominated the information space. And one result of it is an awakening in the United States after years of essentially denial of the obvious. There is a growing awareness in the United States that internet platforms, by their basic function, are undermining public health, they're undermining democracy, privacy, and increasingly the sort of innovation and competition in our economic system. And the election of Joe Biden creates an opportunity for a different approach. And what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes to talk about this, particularly in the context of what Europe is doing. Because I think, again, it is the lessons from Europe that are informing our own attempts in the United States. So I spent my entire life in Silicon Valley. I am, well versed in how these things came to be. And what I want to make sure we understand is that the issue here is not the technology itself. There's nothing wrong with social media. What is wrong is a business model that the Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff characterizes as surveillance capitalism. And that business model creates incentives that undermine public health, democracy, privacy, and competition. And what I think we now know is that there is literally no limit to the harm that they can do. The reason that there's growing awareness in the United States is that in 2020, the United States had indisputably the worst performance relative to the COVID-19 pandemic of any country in the world, bar none. And it wasn't because we don't have a great healthcare system. It wasn't because we don't have enough money to do it. It is because disinformation amplified by Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, YouTube and Google created a tribal reaction to a public health crisis. And as of yesterday, more than 250,000 Americans are dead, at least 225,000 of whom died because the United States did not muster a national consensus to go after a public health problem. And it is now generally well understood in the United States the role that internet platforms played in that they profited from the amplification of this disinformation. In parallel to this, we had the rise of Black Lives Matter, the murder of an innocent Black man named George Floyd, that has triggered inside the country because everyone is at home in lockdown watching the internet. So they all saw this thing in real time. And what that did was they began to see, oh my gosh, white supremacy in the United States has become a much bigger problem because Facebook and YouTube and Twitter in particular benefit economically from increasing extremism. That Facebook employees leaked an internal report that said that when people join extremist groups on Facebook, 64% of the time they do that because Facebook recommended it. And that means in the context of QAnon, which in the United States has been classified by our Federal Bureau of Investigation as a terrorist extremist group, that Facebook has admitted that there were at least 3 million members of QAnon in its Facebook groups and Facebook pages. That means 2 million of those people were radicalized by Facebook. Now, that has changed the conversation. COVID disinformation, which undermined the election directly because it forced everybody to vote by mail, which created an opportunity for Trump to undermine our postal service and then try to undermine confidence in mail-in ballots. That COVID disinformation was out there for everyone to see. And then QAnon and the white supremacy thing is out there for everyone to see. And the astonishing thing was that President Trump received what would have in any other election been more than enough votes to win. In an environment where essentially every one of the people who voted for him was voting because their reality, the one they live in, is formed around disinformation. So what are we going to do? In the United States, we've watched the experiments in Europe very carefully. The state I live in, California, has passed a new law in November that essentially takes the California Computer Privacy Act and gives it regulatory enforcement that should make it at least slightly more effective than GDPR, with the same basic approach and the same basic intent. It's not the same, but conceptually it's going down that path. I think everyone in the privacy world recognizes that that approach is inadequate. That in reality, we have three distinct problems. There's a privacy problem. There's a competition problem, but there is also a safety problem. That the present culture of Silicon Valley does not require the engineers to anticipate harms and attempt to avoid them or mitigate them. And this is the fault of a United States law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. There is now a growing awareness that at a minimum, some kind of amendment will be required. And there's at least some political support for eliminating it entirely. The problem is privacy, safety, and antitrust, competition things need to be done simultaneously. But they don't need to be done in the same place at the same time. And so the most encouraging thing I can say to you in Europe is that I do not believe we need global solutions today. I believe we need every country to follow the thing that its value system and its culture and its laws allow. And that these companies, which are based on automating everything they do, will be forced to essentially create standard rules globally that reflect the most extreme things that take place in individual markets. GDPR helped things in the United States, and we're very appreciative. And I think as we do things related to safety, if we can get Biden to do things related to safety, that would be super helpful. The question is, will he? The most important thing I can tell you is that one of the disinformation campaigns late in the election focused on Joseph Biden's son, Hunter. And it was completely manufactured and revealed as such as it was happening. Thanks in part to a comedian, Sacha Baron Cohen, who put out a new film that had Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, fell for a piece of disinformation. And it deflated it. But Biden, that personal experience with it, has caused Biden to now be aware that this issue matters. And the question is, what will they do? And I do not have high expectations. Biden will not have a functioning majority in Congress with which he can work. And I think it's going to be very slow, and we're still going to be incredibly dependent on Europe to make the moves that we're going to need for this to go forward. Now, relative to this notion of transparency and citizens' councils, I'm a big believer in running every possible experiment. With the real Facebook Oversight Board, what we did was we put together a group of the activists who are paying the most attention. And the thing that became obvious on the first day is that you can only scratch the surface. There are literally billions of messages going through these systems every day. So there are problems of scale, there are problems of latency, the delay between when the thing becomes widely available and when you can do anything to stop it. That's a huge problem. And then the obvious and biggest problem for all these things is that the intent of these platforms is to have highly inflammatory content. It's the lubricant. So hate speech, disinformation, conspiracies are not incidental. They are the lubricant for the business. And so the companies do not want to get rid of it. And so the great challenge we face is that there's a lot of energy that goes into things like the Real Facebook Oversight Board and a great deal of difficulty actually carrying them out. But that's not an argument against doing them. It's just an argument to have low expectations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger, for your insight. Pierre, what is your experience with the pilot project you are running? We shouldn't expect too much, but maybe you have some good news.
It's a work in progress. That's my spoiler alert at this stage. Thank you very much, Alexandra, for the invitation and for your interest in the Social Media Council project. I'm gonna try and share my screen for this brief presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So I'll start with saying maybe a few words of why this project has emerged at Article 19.
Maybe you want to go to presentation mode because we're seeing 2 slides at the time and your notes, and it might be a little small.
Sorry about that. That is due to trying to use 2 screens and the computer and myself being so confused about it. Is that better now?
That's perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start with saying a few words about why we started this project, and I won't dwell too much on this, but it's interesting to mention maybe the fact that we were looking at the impact of content moderation on public debates and finding that a concern in terms of freedom of expression, also in relation to issues such as the promotion of diversity and pluralism in the media landscape. Being impacted by the ubiquitous presence of the social media platforms. Content moderation in itself raises separate concerns in terms of still today it's very much a very opaque process, and it's hard to really know why or how and when it's done. There's a situation of more than weakness, really. It's the fact that individual users may be powerless when their content is taken down, and sometimes it's content that it's very valuable for themselves, be it for business, for personal or artistic expression, or for contributions to public debates. And we were also very concerned that there was no integrated protection for freedom of expression and other fundamental rights in content moderation as it's happening today. Another element in our conversations when we started this project was the situation of local actors. And looking here, not only at people in the US or in Europe, but also in countries that are, I would say, even further away from the center of decisions of social media platforms. And when we have conversations, for example, with journalists from some global South country, they would say to us, we have absolutely no way of reaching out to the big platforms, and civil society actors would say the same thing. So there was a combination of those things, and this has triggered a number of approaches at Article 19. The Social Media Council is one of them, but we also have gone our usual way of doing things, which is the policy and legal analysis. I think the legal work is really our core business or our DNA in the organization, and we've produced a publication such as Regulating Speech by Contract, which you can find on our website. We've also launched a campaign, which we've called Missing Voices, to refer to the people whose content is being taken down and the lack of remedy, this powerlessness situation that I was mentioning. And then we also have people in our legal team working on competition law and how it could lead to creating interoperability and bundling of content moderation on social media platforms. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. Today I'm speaking about the Social Media Council. So what is it? It started as a model that we first developed as an idea, and it's one There were a few other propositions that were similar, or at least some things in common. What we wanted was to suggest the creation of a voluntary compliance mechanism. So in a sense, that's self-regulation, but self-regulation is a word that has become a bit complex to use because it could be a company regulating itself, but it also could mean the creation of a private accountability mechanism created at the industry level or the level of a sector. And that's in that sense comparable to press councils, for instance, that exist in a number of European countries. So voluntary compliance, that's one important feature of the Social Media Council. It's a multi-stakeholder mechanism. So we envisage it as bringing together everyone who has an interest in content moderation issues. So we would have, well, of course, the social media platforms, the big ones and the smaller ones. We would have academia. It's a field, when we look at internet regulation or social media regulation, it's a field that is new, that is changing a lot, and it's almost different every day. So we do need researchers on board. We also think that journalists and media owners should be part of it. Also because they have, one of the reasons being that they have experience with self-regulation and applying principles of ethics to the content that they produce, and using that as a way to hold journalists and media accountable. We also suggested that the advertising industry could be part of the mechanism, being close to the business model problem for social media platforms. Then media regulators could also be part of the people creating and operating this mechanism. And then civil society organizations, and a broad range of them, not only the free speech activists such as ourselves, but also people working to defend marginalized groups in society, for example, just to make sure that we can bring together a representation of the broad diversity of society, including the vulnerable or marginalized groups. The Social Media Council would operate in a transparent way. It would be accountable to the public because it's there to serve the public. And it would have two missions, two main things, although a third one is probably also very important. The first one would be to act as an appeals mechanism. It would be in charge, the Social Media Council would be in charge of making decisions on the revision of individual cases where social media platforms have taken decisions to take content down, or maybe also to leave content there where there were reasons to maybe take it down. This in itself is quite an ambitious project. There are lots of procedural issues to be dealt with in order to ensure, for instance, that the Social Media Council is not going to be drowned in too many cases, so that we would need some sort of filtering mechanisms to ensure that the number of cases that the Social Media Council takes on a yearly basis, for instance, would remain reasonable. But we also want to have procedural rules in there to ensure that it's really accessible to everyone. The second role that we see for the Social Media Council is the creation of recommendations or general guidelines that they would elaborate for social media platforms to deal with certain specific sets of issues. So that's another way, instead of focusing on one individual case that can maybe serve as a precedent and then inform content moderation. Another way to do that is to draft recommendations that can also inform the practices of content moderation. This said, I think the experience of self-regulatory mechanisms such as press council teaches us that a third role that these mechanisms have to play is always to sort of engage into public pedagogy, explaining what they do, what the rules that they apply are, and why they can serve as an effective regulation mechanism. And I think that is a key point in terms of making sure that it can serve as an ally of the general public and serve the public interest. Now, be it for the decisions in individual cases or for the elaboration of a general recommendation, we suggest that the work of the Social Media Council should be based on international standards on human rights. We're not saying that platforms should copy-paste international standards and copy-paste that into their terms of service or their community guidelines, but we're saying that the broad set of rules that we should use to sort of oversee content moderation practices should be this universal body of rules that's been there for quite a long time, that today comes with a lot of very strong interpretation by international courts, by experts, etc. So that's an idea that in itself is also quite complex. It's a field I think that is developing at the moment, also in legal studies, for instance. But that's a way to have like this universal body of rules as the basis for all the work of the Social Media Council. We think that is a mechanism that could exist at both the international or the local level. In some of our wildest dreams while developing this project, we even envisaged that we might at some point have social media councils in a number of countries, and then they would gather together in an international social media council for coordination purposes and so on. But I think it's very important to consider the local anchorage of this sort of mechanism, because, well, there's lots to say about the oversight board of Facebook, but one thing that it seems to be is it seems to be very far away from the local ground, even if they've tried to recruit people with diverse backgrounds and a fair range of linguistic capacities and so on. It still is, it's very far away from the ground, and understanding content moderation, understanding any case of you know, when it's about the meaning of an act of speech, you need to understand the local context quite well. And for that, you would need people who speak the language, who know the culture, who understand the politics, the history, well, basically know the country, and probably more than one voice on these topics in order to produce an informed decision. So that's the model that we have tried to develop, and we've been helped by a great number of people in doing that work. You've mentioned Alexandra David Kay, who endorsed the idea when we first published it. We've had a number of international occasions to share the idea with platforms, with academia, with civil society organization, and engage in a fair ground of in a fair broad range of conversations. But we also wanted to sort of test the idea and see if it could actually work and if it could be something more than a model. And we are trying to do that at the moment, as you've mentioned, in Ireland. It's really a work in progress. So I can only say very few things about it because I have no guarantee that we will be able to actually, you know, bring it to completion. But we're certainly learning a lot from it. And at the moment, I would say that I'm moderately optimistic that we will be able to get to somewhere with this work. What we're doing is we've been approaching a broad range of the stakeholders. I've mentioned the categories before. And we've asked them, so we've got this little silly idea, what do you guys think? And in the first round of conversations, we've had overall a positive welcome. So we thought it was worth continuing the conversations and trying to sort of refine the model and try to translate it into how it could work into the Irish context that we're also working to understand, because we're not based in Ireland. So that's also part of the work for us. One of the things that emerged from those conversations is the fact that, well, Ireland is engaged into a process of revising the law on media and online regulation. There's an online safety bill and media regulation legislative works that is started in part because it's the transposition of the AVMS directive. There's the idea in there to transform the broadcast regulator into an online regulator. And so we've looked at the idea of trying to ensure that the Social Media Council could fit within what is called a co-regulatory framework. So looking for a complementarity between the future regulatory authority and the SMC. And that's where our efforts are being concentrated at the moment. I'm not sure how much time I've spoken, but I think I'll stop just here. I'm very happy to take any questions on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre. I think there will be a lot of questions, which is very interesting. Especially, I think the fact that you can scale it locally and regionally in order to understand what's really going on in a certain region. I think that is a very interesting aspect. Yeah, but before we go into it, Eileen has the floor. What can citizens' assemblies do? What is your experience in Ireland? What are your remarks? Go ahead.
So hope you can all see the screen now. Yes, so I just want to state the obvious at the beginning, which is clearly that platforms need oversight. But I think the popular discussion of this often focuses on the symptoms of things that have gone completely wrong. So the hate speech, the disinformation, the corrosive advertising practices. But the platforms need oversight for a much deeper reason, and that's because they've come to dominate so many aspects of economic, political, and social life. So they, in effect, are our public sphere. But they don't have the governance rules, the standards, or the norms that meet that responsibility. So instead, they have community standards or terms of service that give them this unaccountable power. And I think that's the main reason why we need oversight. What I'm going to talk about are some of the existing models and how citizens could be brought into that. So often when people talk about transparent or accountability and transparency, they've become like buzzwords. And the problem is that transparency alone, I think, does very little. In particular, 2 nights ago, you had the webinar on algorithms, and that's a classic example. Algorithms are incredibly complex. Even the engineers who design them don't fully understand how they work. So providing more transparency over something like that is of no great benefit to a citizen. So you can tick a box that you've provided transparency, but what have people actually gained there? So transparency has to be matched with accountability. And that means you need people who are experts and can independently audit what is happening and do so in the interests of citizens and in the interests of democratic values. So those 2 things have to go closely together. And this is a point I'll come back to about expertise is really important. A lot of these issues are extremely complex, and you cannot expect the average citizen to invest the time or have the ability and skills to do so on their own. Then if we think about how the platforms have responded to this, so there's been the appointment of chief ethics officers and things like that, particularly in relation to algorithms and data. And then of course the Facebook Oversight Board, which was the big news during the summer. And so much has already been said about the Facebook Oversight Board, so I'm not going to go into all of the common things that you can find in many other places. But just this idea, which Mark Zuckerberg was quoted as saying that it would reflect, the norms and values of people around the world. And like, this is clearly fanciful, that you can take 20 people and they can reflect these values. Even more so when the vast majority of those people are based in or American and have legal backgrounds. It's a very narrow niche lens to take on content. And then on top of that, there is the problem of scale that Roger mentioned, which is a problem, I think, for any approach that is going to review content. There's just an enormous volume of it. So this is a big challenge. So citizen assemblies, for those of you who are not familiar with them, are an innovation in democratic practice. And it wasn't invented in Ireland, but we've adopted it very much and done a huge amount with it over the last few years. So the basic concept is that you take a group of citizens randomly selected, so a bit like jury duty, and then they are brought together to debate a policy challenge. And they then deliver recommendations to government, who can choose to act on that, but they have the advice and expertise that came from the citizen assembly. Now, crucially, this is not just about bringing together citizens to let them hammer out issues amongst themselves. It is highly structured. And there are 5 kind of key features. First is that the participants reflect the diversity of the population. So typically there's about 100 citizens, and they will be pegged to the diversity of the population itself. They hear expert evidence, and the expertise is clearly defined as expertise. But it isn't just expert evidence. They will also hear from testimony from the various interest groups and from individuals who've been affected by the issue. As Alexandria mentioned at the beginning, when people talk about hate speech, it's important to hear from the people that are actually being attacked. What are their views? How do they understand it? The deliberation itself is facilitated by moderators, and this is also very important because it ensures, first of all, that people are respectful of each other, but if they're having any problems and don't understand something, they can ask for help, they can ask for clarification, they can get the experts to come back in and explain something a bit more clearly. The whole process is overseen by apolitical independent organizations because it must be independent of government and independent of interest groups who are invested in the topic. And then finally, the goal is to reach some kind of consensus. And typically in the Irish case, that involves making recommendations that are then put forward to government. So we've had citizen assemblies on very contentious issues like abortion, gay marriage, and climate change. And remarkably, people were willing to put aside their own personal opinion and think of the common good. And I think that's a really crucial part here about structured deliberation, as opposed to people making their own, making arguments on their own case. And related to that, this idea of the democratic common good, I think one of the most interesting things in Europe, and particularly some of the work coming out of the European Commission, whether it's about disinformation or many of the other digital problems, is that they do tie it to democracy, to the Democracy Action Plan, and see that it's not just about fixing some technology problem. We have to also reinvigorate our democracies. And that's why keeping citizens involved in the discussion is so important. The research that's been done on the Irish cases and also increasingly on other cases comes out with some crucial findings, which is that ordinary citizens can understand and evaluate complex information. So I was saying at the beginning that transparency alone isn't enough because a lot of the issues are really complex. But put in the right environment, citizens can understand complex information when expertise is made accessible to them. They can also deliver evidence-based solutions and recommendations to policymakers. They do have these abilities. One of the biggest stumbling blocks with citizen assemblies was this perception that ordinary citizens just can't understand these things and they wouldn't be able to do it. What these initiatives have repeatedly shown is that they can in the right circumstances. Related to that, very importantly, is that the broader public have confidence in their judgments, that they're impartial, that they were grounded in evidence. And some of the Irish work has found that that then lends more credibility to the government actions. So for example, again, on this hugely contentious issue of abortion, when the government decides to call a referendum on abortion, it is able to say, this was a recommendation from a citizen assembly. It's not government making a decision or pushing forward something without consulting citizens first. So for the type of things we've been talking about here, I mean, nobody wants a scenario where you would expect citizens to commit the time to reviewing individual content decisions or case-by-case basis. It's this issue of standards and norms and what are they, whether that's at the national level or at a European level, and making recommendations that can then be taken up by policymakers or by social media councils or by the oversight boards. And I thought it was very interesting at the beginning when Roger said, we need to try so many different things. It's not a question of one model versus the other model. And in fact, I think a citizen assembly model would work really well to inform the social media councils and even to inform an oversight board in an expanded way. And then a final point about norms and standards is, that they're just changing so much, and digital technology is changing so much. The digital environment in 20 years is not going to look anything like it does now. In the same way that the DSA is replacing an e-commerce directive from 20 years ago that could never have foreseen the types of debates and arguments we'd be having right now. So when we're talking about designing models to improve the environment, it can't be for improving the Facebook and Google of today. We have to be thinking about how do we make these technologies, how do we ensure that digital services of the future have got democratic norms at their heart and do have citizens as part of that conversation. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen. That was very interesting. And I really like that idea to trust citizens to be able to do the right thing if you put them in the conditions to have all the knowledge to take an informed decision and to come up, not only to protest, but to come up with a constructive solution. Because I think the vote on Brexit sort of a little bit destroyed this trust in direct democracy, but the Citizens' Assembly are rebuilding it because it shows that you only need to create the right conditions for people to be able to make good decisions. So that's really encouraging. So would you like to comment on each other on what you've heard? Otherwise, we already have questions piling up and all the audience can start raising their hands. We will take people, there's already somebody, but first I'd like to give the floor back to my guests. Is there anything you would like to comment on each other? Roger?
I really agree with, I thought both of those presentations were fantastic. And what I hope we will do in the Q&A is, in fact, I'm looking at some of the questions that have been asked. And it seems to me that the notion of citizens being part of this is actually essential. I think, for example, when you're trying to fight disinformation, the most important thing is to get as many people as possible educated and understanding what's going on. So I think that Eileen's approach to this, I find, to me, I don't know the answer, but it sounds exactly right. And this notion of, that it's also about informing regulators, policymakers, that the Citizens Council, one of its great benefits is building political support for action, which Eileen talked about that in the context of abortion in Ireland. And I think that, it is my great hope. In the United States, we've effectively had a citizen thing related to COVID. And now that everybody's going to be locked down again, the citizens' votes are coming in.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to explain one thing on my presentation, or Eileen mentioned, well, transparency is not enough, and that's absolutely true. But that's why the first night of this event series, we discussed the different models on how to make transparency something that is the sort of the fact-based, the evidence that then oversight committees and audit authorities and citizens' councils can use to take more informed decisions. I think Roger points that out in his book also, that like when you started criticizing Facebook, it was sort of a gut feeling that there was something going wrong, and this is increasing and increasing, but we still don't have the evidence. If you talk to academia, they say, well, yeah, it sort of feels like it, but we can't prove it. And I still speak to audiences that happen to say, well, yeah, but that's just the downside, but you don't really know what's going on, because we don't know, because they don't give us access to the data. So that's the whole point of getting access to the data. So academia, scientists, people who are able to read this data can give us some evidence, which we then can work on. As policymakers, it's very difficult to say, well, I'm going to draft a new law, and it's just my gut feeling that there's something going wrong. It's difficult to argue that.
I think, in fairness, I think that the academics who make that argument are also lobbying to get access to data. It seems to me that there are some things we know that are indisputably true, right? We understand that disinformation is much more prevalent today. Yeah. And you can see the direct link between the business model of these companies and the amplification of disinformation. It is also true that the recommendation engines of these companies drive people towards extremism. Those linkages, you may not have things that prove it quantitatively, but the cause and effect is really, really obvious. The mainstreaming in the United States of QAnon, there's only one way that could have happened, right? And so the great Thomas of Occam, had this notion now popularly known as Occam's razor, which is that, faced with a set of choices, the simplest explanation is most likely the accurate one. And I think in this particular case, Occam's razor serves us very effectively as a shortcut. And I don't think policymakers, if policymakers are going to wait for data, then they have to insist on absolute transparency today. If they're not going to insist on absolute transparency, then we need to act on the evidence we have. And the evidence we have is copious.
Yeah, I know. It's never black and white, but I think we can start legislating and at the same time asking for transparency. So the next time we legislate, we have some more evidence.
I also think the threat of legislation is the best way to cause transparency to happen.
Exactly. That's what I'm advocating it. Great. Let's start with the audience. Colin is the first to have the floor. Please, we have a lot of questions, so please be brief. Just stick to a minute, maximum 2 if that's possible.
Okay, thanks, Alexandra, and thank you to the panel for the talks. I should start by clarifying that I'm totally on board with almost everything that's been said so far with the toxicity of surveillance capitalism. And I'm going to do my little bit to fight against it in the web search. So I have a question for Roger in particular, and I'd like to thank him for all the work he's doing and for having the courage to see and write about Facebook in a way different from how he did before. But Roger, in 2018, you said, I'm okay with Google being a monopolist in search. Now, others have suggested that Google search should be turned perhaps into utility. But I would say that, crawling and indexing the web well involves a lot of choices and innovations that few people know about. That's my opinion. And, I have a kind of some inside knowledge on that. So, Google have successfully cultured a bit of a myth that they crawl almost everything that matters on the web, and that most of the innovation in searches is already being done by them. So have you, or will you rethink what you said back then? And if you were a European citizen or an entrepreneur, do you think perhaps you might think differently?
Oh, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I definitely do not believe that Google is either innocent or in any way harmless. There is recent evidence that I believe it's 47% of Google searches never result in people clicking through to a link. So effectively, Google has taken investment made by others, co-opted that information, presented as a page. And then if you want people to actually click through on a link, you have to pay Google for that privilege. That is clearly anti-competitive behavior. And when you integrate that with Google's behavior in the browser, where it's increasingly trying to force all activity into the Google search model, and if you look at their activity in maps and video and all these other things, where they're clearly preferencing their own products to the detriment of others, I think that Google is, from an antitrust perspective, incredibly harmful. And it starts from their control of the infrastructure of digital advertising and flows outward. In my book, I focused on Facebook because that was the one where I was closest to the principles, and it was the one that caught my attention first. In doing the work to try to understand Facebook, I've come to understand Google in new ways. And I think Professor Zuboff has the definitive analysis of Google, and I am extremely comfortable with her conclusion, which is that Google's desire to increase efficiency, they're placing efficiency at the top of the value stream, is a clear and present danger to democracy. Because in a liberal democracy, we value self-determination, we value democracy itself, and both of those are inefficient by design. So when Google is doing things like Sidewalk Labs, which is part of Alphabet, which is smart cities, their goal is to effectively create value for themselves by substituting the efficiency of algorithms for the inefficiency of self-determination and democracy. Now, they don't phrase it that way, but if you study what they were proposing to do in Toronto closely, that is quite clearly what would have happened.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, smart cities is another issue we will have to tackle at a certain point, but that's not the topic of the DSA. It's interesting that Google, one of the arguments that Google is going to make and is already making, that any kind of legislation or regulation will restrict European consumers' choices, which I don't believe is true, absolutely, but therefore that was an interesting question. So we would have Stefan Zara next, and since this is organized by me, I'm a member of the Green Party, and we strive to give the same amount of speaking time to women as to men, because otherwise usually the men have more time to speak, especially on digital panels. Sarah goes first. You have the floor, Sarah.
Thank you, Alexandra. I have a question for Pierre, specifically about how to develop norms for these social media councils. So you mentioned that these norms will be based on international human rights standards, but of course, many of these cases still deal with like offline situations. So there are a few cases, for example, from the European Court of Human Rights on content moderation and filtering, but how would these councils go about developing norms for things like filtering news feeds, ranking content, personalizing content, and really like how people's information environment is shaped?
Thank you, Sarah. Pierre?
Can I have a couple of hours on this? It's a fascinating, thank you very much for the question. And I think it's a fascinating one, and I see it as a new area for development for international human rights. I think that we've got a body of rules in international law that is solid, that is being interpreted by, as I was saying, international courts, but also a broad range of experts. And that, I think, is a good basis for the people in a social media council representing the various groups, the various stakeholders that they would come from, to start elaborating their own decisions or their own general recommendations. It is clear that some issues have never been dealt with under international law, as you've mentioned, but I think that it's possible to use international law as the basis to look at these questions. It may be necessary, maybe, to sort of make it easier for the Social Media Council to start its work, that its first task could be to elaborate a code of principles, which would be a code of principles for content moderation based on international human rights law. So that might be a way for the members of the council to start working together when they first meet. And it's also a task that I think would be very useful to sort of make it more precise, the way they would approach a number of issues. I also think that this particular topic, the application of international human rights law to content moderation, is really being talked about more and more, so that the knowledge, the ideas that we have on this is really growing. And that's, I think, is a very interesting thing, and I'm being quite optimistic about the development about that part of international law.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on this. I think that's really interesting, and I would put in a question as well that is in the chat and the Q&A tool that says, what about simply getting rid of Section 230? And Section 230, maybe for the Europeans not familiar, it's sort of what is our liability exemption in Europe according to e-commerce. Well, not exactly the same thing, but the idea. So platforms are not liable for user-generated content, if I may summarize that so briefly. And the question goes on, what about getting rid of Section 230 and consider social media as publishers like traditional news outlets, which is something some European publishers would like to see as well. So that's one part of the question. The second part is, if we sort of have content moderation governed by these principles of international human rights law, what do we do with freedom of speech of users? I asked that question last year because I really liked the idea to Daphne Kellner, who is an American expert, I mean, the main legal expert on liability on social media. And she she wasn't a great fan, basically, because obviously it means intervening, but I don't dislike it. So maybe to open it up for Roger, I think the question on getting rid of Section 230, you mentioned that in the beginning, that was directed to you. While the commission is saying they don't want to get rid of liability exemption.
So the debate in the United States has, I think, changed dramatically in just the past 3 months. The problem with Section 230 is that the courts in the United States have consistently interpreted it as providing blanket immunity to internet platforms because they host other people's content. That is to say, it doesn't actually get down to looking at what kinds of content should give rise to liability. It basically says you cannot be prosecuted. That has been the interpretation. The law itself is actually not problematic. The law itself is designed to encourage platforms to use their discretion to ensure a safe place by getting rid of dangerous content. That's not how it's been interpreted and not how it's been acted upon. So the question is, how do you introduce liability? On one side, you could get rid of 230 entirely. The other side is you could amend it so that you very explicitly create liability for a range of harms. My partner, Sacha Baron Cohen, the comedian, is a strong advocate of getting rid of it and making internet platforms equivalent to traditional media. The legal scholar Marianne Franks argues strenuously for amending 230. The argument for amending it is simply that there are some benefits from an entrepreneurship point of view of giving people the chance to moderate without being prosecuted. I do not know how this is going to come down. In the United States right now, Republicans are trying to use Section 230 to, in fact, infringe on speech. So I find that the whole exercise is very complicated, but I do think an amendment is probably the right way to start, but I'm open to the notion of eliminating it entirely. The thing that is essential is to recognize that, as with privacy and as with competition, all of this derives from the surveillance capitalism business model. And there is no simple solution here. And I got to be honest with you, I do not believe Biden has a working majority in the US Congress, even if they take the 2 seats in Georgia. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for him to make legislative changes. And I mean, I'm hopeful, but I'm not confident that that's going to happen.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Eileen, want to come in?
Yeah,
on
I'd just add there that I think the platform versus publisher debate is just really unhelpful, because the platforms are clearly nothing like traditional publishers. And just because they have, the argument is that they have a stronger relationship and responsibility to the content they host than they're currently considered responsible for. But that doesn't make them publishers like news media, and replacing one bad law with another bad law isn't going to get us anywhere. So we need is a different concept to understand this new role and what we're going to do going forward. And in a way, it's actually quite sad that this far into it, we're still having this same debate.
And can I just reiterate, every word Eileen just said was solid gold here. Let me add one thing. There is a new notion in the United States that we need to impose on these companies a duty of loyalty. It's a very old concept that comes from English common law, but the notion is that if you have power in an economic relationship, say you're a doctor to a patient or a financial services provider to a client, that you are always required to put the interests of the person with less power first. You have to craft a business model that never deprecates the client, never harms the client. That notion is something that is circulating in legal circles as a response to Eileen's point, because these are not publishers. What they do is targeted individually. And because of that, they have a power relationship that no media company ever had before it. So please listen to Eileen. She's absolutely right on this.
Thank you very much. I think we can take another oral question. That would be Stefan, who's next in line. And I would encourage everybody to raise their hands if they want to speak, especially the women. Stefan, you have the floor. You have to unmute yourself. We unmuted you.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Hello and good evening from Germany. My name is Stefan Herwig, and I'm a part of a small internet governance think tank, and we did some research on platform economy and its effects. And maybe we started out a little earlier than other people because we started out already in 2010 on platform economy. The enormous, I have a statement, and then I promise I'm going to close with a question that hopefully will be very interesting. The enormous market power of the largest digital platforms stems from something that has left many parties, scientists, and the legislators wandering for a long time because it's based on consumer decisions. In data protection, this phenomenon even has its own name. It's called the privacy paradox. Everybody says my privacy is important to us, but then I'm still going to buy the cheapest Google phone or Android phone that I can, right? Or most of the people will. Has anybody bothered to look at the problems caused by platforms from an economic standpoint? Because economy has essential theories to explain this paradoxical consumer behavior and consumer choices. And I'm worried that the European, that the economic problem, is about to be transformed to a simple competition law problem by the European Commission, which is it's not. I mean, there is a competition law side to it, but there's also another side to it. To my experience, this economic perspective is essential to solve the problems. And there is an extensive backend in economy. There's a backend tool set that was just completely ignored and discarded, not only by the European Commission, but also by the US legislator, right? Especially on the lack of transparency on entire markets, on so-called externalities, which reflects the liability problems that we've just discussed, like the fallout of the platform algorithms to the society. And again, it's not only competition law that should be addressed here. So has anybody bothered, especially maybe also a question to Alexandra Geser, but also to Roger McNamee, because I know you have an economic perspective. Has anybody bothered to look at the problems of consumer decisions and platform economy from this economic perspective?
Would you like me to say something on that?
Please do.
So thank you for the question. So Shoshana Zuboff focused on that exact issue. And there are a number of other people who have looked at sort of the social dynamics of internet platforms. And the critical thing is that if we think about how regulation works today, and GDPR would be an example of notice and consent. All of these things assume roughly equal awareness and understanding of the economic relationship going in. And that's demonstrably not true. That notice and consent fails because the notice is at best bad faith, and at worst completely misleading. And the consent is coerced. And so in that context, what we're dealing with here is a highly predatory business model. So Zuboff would argue, and I strongly agree with this, that slavery was banned in Western democracies because it violated principles of, human rights as well as economic principles. And surveillance capitalism actually violates, in slightly different ways, but it violates all of the same principles. It takes away self-determination involuntarily, and it undermines democracy, and it undermines competition in the economy because the uneven distribution of the benefits of surveillance capitalism. And so Zuboff argues that the entire business model should be banned the same way that slavery was banned, and that there's just no place for it in a liberal democracy. I think that is the debate we should be having now. And that what's great is that we've been doing this organic thing of trying different things, but we should also be debating economists, philosophers, policymakers, whether the whole thing isn't so morally corrupt that it should just not be allowed, because it wouldn't eliminate social media. It wouldn't eliminate search. It wouldn't eliminate any of the functions. It would just force them to do them under business terms that are not predatory, which is what they did before they created this business model. So we know they can do it. We just have to have the will to require it. And to do that, we have to have the debate and decide that's what we want to do.
Yeah. And Eileen, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I'm no economist, but there are a lot of interesting studies of that in terms of the impact of platforms on the news media. So the news media became institutionally dependent on platforms because that's where the people are. So they're providing the content. And then as soon as an algorithm can just be changed on a whim and suddenly they can't access people, or they're told loads of people are accessing video, so change your content to video, and the evidence wasn't there behind it. And often the argument is made that it should be up to the individual citizen to know that they need to support journalism, when in actual fact, most people can't tell that, you know, if they're accessing the news on Facebook or they're viewing The Guardian on Twitter, that, you know, that's of no benefit to the news media. So it's an awful lot to expect an individual citizen who's been given no background or no support to be making decisions, when actual fact, the issue is, as Roger says, about this business model and the relationship. And the current Australian proposals are really interesting, where they're going to compel the platforms to tell Australian publishers if there's any change to the algorithm that would impact their business, because so many businesses are dependent. So it's about protecting that relationship and protecting those businesses.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to make a few remarks as well, because the imperfections and the flaws of economic theory is something that I'm very interested in, also from other points of view. But I would like to come back to Roger. What is it exactly, if you say, let's just get rid of it, let's just ban it, what exactly would we have to put into the DSA to do that? To tackle the business model? What's the point, really, the most important one for you?
So if you sit there thinking there's a couple points that would allow you to do it. The first, think of it, you have to start at the two extremes. Declaring that personal data is a human right and not an asset is a core element of this thing. You simply, right now, there is in the United States a completely unregulated market in personal data. And as far as I can tell, the weight of bad things versus benefits is completely out of line from that. The other part of the problem is the use of that data to both predict human behavior and then manipulate human behavior. To this point, it's mostly been about advertising, but it is rapidly migrating. As these companies get more information, they are vertically integrating into places where they do direct manipulation. The Libra currency project at Facebook would be an example. The Sidewalk Labs from Alphabet is another example, where their Pokemon Go would be an example. And so these are things where they're not capturing the benefit from advertising, they're capturing the benefit from actual manipulation of human behavior. And to me, business models, you know, it's one thing to do it in a broadcast model, right? To try to persuade people with advertising in a broadcast model is demonstrably less harmful than doing it with perfect information about each individual and then hitting the signals that can inflame those people and cause them to change their behavior. And so I would approach it from both directions, and that, you know, this would be, at least in the short run, quite disruptive, because the advertising industry has persuaded itself that it has to have this in order to win. The truth is, there's been an experiment in the Netherlands of using contextual targeting that has worked fantastically. In fact, a lot better than cookies and individual targeting. And so I'm sort of sitting there going, you know, this may turn out to be a win for everybody, but people don't like change. And because they don't like change, the resistance to it has been, you know, from the exact people who'd be the largest beneficiaries, which comes back to Eileen's point about, you know, people practically need a graduate degree I mean, I spent 34 years studying this thing. And when I first started to see the problems, I still didn't know what was going on. And it's taken me 4 years of nonstop research to understand what I understand. And I'm incredibly sympathetic to anybody who sits there and goes, wow, this is really complex. And my answer is, yep, it is. These guys are really smart and they've had a long time to put this stuff in place. And, you know, we're at a big disadvantage and we have to make up for that with solidarity and creativity. And listen to these two. I mean, Eileen and Pierre here, these are really important ideas, really important.
Absolutely, that's why we invited them. And just you can't know that, but among yesterday's guests were Linda and Tom from Sterf, who works for Dutch broadcaster NPO, who had a presentation exactly on that model of sophisticated contextual advertising that proved to be a lot more successful than targeted advertising. So this is something we are really trying to push here in Europe and to drum up a debate about that. And I'm hopeful. I think we can do that. Maybe we have, I mean, this might even be good news because we actually have the right to data protection and privacy as a fundamental right in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. We have GDPR, we have an enforcement issue actually. And now in legislative terms, the real conundrum is how not to infringe on GDPR and put something on top in order to stop the business model. So that's trying sort of what we're trying to figure out as legislators and the European Commission as well. But this is really the direction, I think, in which we are going. I'd like just briefly to come back to the original question, because I think that the flaws in economic theory are really one of the reasons for many problems we are dealing with today, from imbalances in the digital world to climate change, for example, the climate catastrophe. And I think, Stefan, you mentioned that externalities, that economic theory doesn't consider negative effects of a certain business model as long as the company itself doesn't have to pay for them, but society pays for them, governments pay for them, citizens pay for them. We have that as far as industry is concerned, and the climate and ecological catastrophe we are going towards too. This is because economic theory doesn't count ecological externalities. We have that in the gender issue, we saw that in the COVID crisis, that it was very easy just to close schools and childcare facilities because women just stayed home and did the work unpaid that usually people would do being paid for. That's an externality that's not counted. And this is the same principle. Then you asked about consumer choice. Well, the real problem is that in social media, you are not the consumer, the product. And this is something that people have just started realizing, I think, in the last years, and most people still don't realize that they are the product and not the consumer. And that makes it difficult. Then there's this all is free culture, you know, as long as you if you get the whole population used to getting information and basic services for free, it's difficult to have a different business model where you have to pay for it. And most people don't realize they're paying with their data. So that's what I think Eileen or Roger said, it's perfect. You don't have a situation of perfect information, which is the basis of the economic theory, that you have two actors who have perfect information about the situation. This is exactly what you don't have, because the model is so complicated that everybody has difficulties understanding it. And and then you still have the problem with being it so difficult. It's very difficult to build a political consensus around it. Because yesterday we had this very interesting event on targeted advertising and what the alternatives could be. But the conversation you have around it gets so extremely technical that, I mean, I could follow it because I've been working on these issues for months, and I've really been reading and speaking about it outside my normal legislative work, and really delve deep into it, because I saw people start of dropping out of the webinar at a certain point when it got really technical, because you can't follow, and therefore it's so difficult to explain to people what it does. And then there's a sense, politically speaking, since the question was directed to me as well, what I see with the generation of my kids, for example, who grew up in this world, there is a sense of frustration of thinking, well, it's like that anyway, there's nothing you can do about it. that's how it is, because even if companies, especially when companies who are maybe known for good privacy standards, and there are scandals showing that they don't care about privacy either, it's like, well, it doesn't matter. You can't do the right thing anyway. There's no choice to make. And these companies are so powerful that you can't fight them. I think that is the narrative that is really, really dangerous, to say, well, they're so powerful, there's nothing you can do about that. And this is what we are trying to tackle here in Europe. Even if the law we are going to make will not be perfect, it shows that you can tackle them, you can do something, and I hope it will have some effect. Okay, anybody else wants to take the floor? Stefan, you still have a hand raised. Do you want to come back in, or is that still there from before? Otherwise, I'll have a look at the written questions. Everybody is busy answering them. I think it would be interesting to go a little, oh no, here, there's Florian. Okay, Florian, you have the floor.
Can you hear me? Hello, my name is Florian. I'm from Austria. I work at the Austrian Academy of Science. And I've got one comment and one question regarding Pierre's presentation. And I think it has a big value, because in this case, maybe also self-regulation or regulation by society can work, because here it's about content, and it's always good not to have the government in. But the other side, when we talk about targeting and when we talk about competition issues, then we will have strong and hard regulation by the governments. So, but for content moderation, that could work more with the civil society, so we can take back the issue to the civil society. But I have one question regarding such media councils. What about the funding? Who should fund it? And what about the speed? Because often you need very fast decisions. If somebody is insulted, if it's harassment of women, for example, then you need fast decisions to get things down. So how could we handle that problem in a social media council? That would be my questions. Thank you.
That was
Thank you for the comment and the question. On funding, there are three options that we've got in our thinking so far. The important thing being to ensure that wherever the money comes from, it does not undermine the capacity of the social media council to operate independently. Part of the money could come from government, part of the money could come from the social media companies, and the third option would be a private foundation, possibly internationally. I'm not going to go into the details. Very happy to say more if you want to drop me an email. In terms of the speed for the mechanism that would review individual decisions, there are in judicial procedures things that such as provisional decisions that can be made while you make a decision on the topic. For example, you might decide that provisionally you're going to keep the content on the website, or you're going to take it down while you take the time to reach a decision. So I think that can serve as a source of inspiration to make sure that the SMC can, on the one hand, take the time necessary to make a well-informed decision and well-debated decision, but also making sure that there's a solution to sort of provisionally deal with content that is problematic.
Eileen, do you want to come in on that? I think that was relevant for the citizens' assemblies as well.
Well, with the citizen assembly model, the funding is really important that it's separate from government, that it is seen to be an apolitical organization. And I think so. I don't want to present citizen assemblies as the solution to everything. Ireland may be a special case because it's quite a small country. So it could be an easy place to begin with these ideas, and people are relatively confident in the system. We've actually had conversations with Pierre about running the social media councils in Ireland. And again, one of the ideas was, because it is a small country, it can be quite easy to bring together the different actors and get them in the same room because they already know each other, and perhaps get them to fund something together.
Okay, thank you very much. Great. I think we are at the end. That was quick. I will keep looking into that. I said that before. No, I didn't. I said that to Eileen on the phone on this afternoon. I tried last year to set up a pilot project in the European Parliament. We have the possibility to suggest pilot projects. And I tried to set up a pilot project of citizens' assemblies for hate speech, to come up with some proposal how to regulate hate speech on the European level as a small piece of what the Digital Services Act should do. And unfortunately, it wasn't approved by the Commission because they didn't really understand it. And I mean, it was okay this year because with COVID, it would have been difficult anyway, but I will repropose it. I think it's a really great idea. Yeah, I think that's it. I would like to thank the speakers very, very much. I think that was a really insightful discussion. I would really like to thank you for your precious contribution. We will continue this conversation because in December, the real Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act will come. And I hope we will be in close touch to discuss the proposals to bring in social media councils. And I hope we will be able to be in close touch with Roger McNamee and have good transatlantic relations as well, because we are aware in Europe. We can't hear you, Roger, you're muted.
I would be honored. I have such great hope for Europe. I truly believe that Europe is much further along in reflecting upon the issues here and has, I think, at the moment, more stable democracies in which to make change. And so anything I can do to be helpful with, I would be honored to do, because I'm inspired by the work going on in Europe and hopeful that, collectively we'll find answers to all of this.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate, and I think we will have to do it collectively. I agree. I think that we have more stable democracies in Europe, but we do have our issues as well. And I think we should be quick to reform social networks, the relation between democracy and big tech in order to keep those democracies. And I think we will need your help as the people who really know what's going on in Silicon Valley, what these companies have in mind, though, how they work. So I'm really looking forward to do that. Lots of open questions. Let's continue the discussion on Twitter. Please follow me in social media. Still the place where we can share information best. Subscribe to the newsletter. Maybe you did when you registered for the event. If you didn't, come and visit my website. And you will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording in case you want to recommend it to someone or have another look at it. Usually at Second Sight, you find new things as well to look at. Thank you all very much. I would like to thank the audience, everybody who participated with question, who spoke in the debate or wrote a question in the Q&A tool. We'll be in touch, we'll inform you, and we will be very much looking forward to your input for the work on the Digital Services Act. And most important of all, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful evening. And Roger, have a wonderful day.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
So Alexandra, thank you very much.
I think we're still, yeah, I thank you. Are we still online? Yeah, we are. Kirsten?
Let's say goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much,
But
Roger.
Alexandra, thank you for the opportunity.
By email. Thank you for being here.
And I hope we will stay in touch, because this was a terrific event. I really learned from both of the other panelists, and I'm excited to learn more about these ideas of the citizen panels, because it can't possibly hurt, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get something good out of it.
Yeah, I'm very confident too. And Lawrence Lessing is doing that in the United States, actually.
Lawrence, he's fantastic. He's a good friend, and I am, as I say, I don't think any of us knows the exact answer. So we have to try things, right? And it's okay if we try different things in different places. And you know, it's I want to be supportive of everybody who wants to try.
Great. Thank you so much.
What a pleasure. Thank you so very, very much. We'll be in touch.
Have a wonderful day.